in South Africa, and the country continues to navigate a complex history with deep-seated racial trauma constantly showing up in our national discourse. It seems now more than ever it's become very important for our national discourse to foster an environment where we look into the injustices of the past. So let's do this with writer and political analyst Malaika Mahlatsi on her opinion piece entitled "The Dangerous Myth of Reverse Racism in South Africa." Malaika, good morning. Thanks as always for your time. Let's start with the definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. How do you define reverse apartheid or reverse racism, or how has it been defined in the South African context?
Good morning, Iman, and good morning to all your viewers. So the concept of reverse racism, right, or what in South Africa they would call reverse apartheid, is basically this idea that affirmative action and similar programs that are race conscious, right, that are aimed at redressing racial inequalities arising from, centuries of colonialism, decades of apartheid, are forms of white racism, right? So the idea basically is rooted in this belief that any attempts by a government or an organization or institution to redress some of these injustices using whether legislative mechanisms or any other kinds of programs or instruments is in fact fundamentally about anti-white racism, and that these are basically reversing or in the context of South Africa, they are basically redoing or reversing apartheid, except this time around, white people who were initially the beneficiaries of apartheid are now on the receiving end, and supposedly black people are now the architects of this reversal of this racism. It's in South Africa, of course, we call it reverse apartheid on the basis of our own apartheid history, but it's a very global concept, a very global idea that is being experienced in many parts of the world, in Australia, in the US, in the UK, certainly in the US now. There is this strong belief that white people there is a growing anti-white, anti-American sentiment in America and across the world.
I want to hold on with the global north for just a moment, Malaika, just to really locate the conversation in South Africa, where again it's gained so much heat. And now that you've defined those concepts, let's talk about the response then. Why is it necessary to use policy and other instruments to correct the race-based injustices of South Africa's past?
I mean, South Africa is a democratic country, right? We are a constitutional democracy. Since 1994, we have been a constitutional democracy. And so what this means is that the kinds of changes that the government can institute have to rely largely on legislative instruments. And these legislative instruments, therefore, inform the kinds of policies, the kinds of resources, financial and otherwise, that get directed towards this program of redressing past injustices. And of course, past injustices have to be redressed because the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of apartheid in South Africa have been so devastating that more than 30 years later, its remnants continues to be felt and seen in the makeup of South African society, in our very segmented labor market, in the racialized form of the institutions and racial capitalism as a base for it. And so government needs to bring these instruments in place to try as far as possible to level the playing field for a historically underprivileged but also disenfranchised majority of black people, colored people, and Indian people who were on the receiving end of apartheid. And it really is fundamentally, Iman, rooted in this idea of justice, right? For us to restore an order in a society in which human beings can exist as fully functional human beings in a society that recognizes their humanity and that recognizes the need for their justice.
Malaika, another centerpiece of what is shaping up to be a highly polarized discussion in South Africa emanates from those who think, well, what you've just described in redressing the past has gone too far and is creating a new paradigm of inequality and exclusion. How do you answer that voice?
Colonialism and apartheid went too far, Iman. They went too far. They went as far as dispossessing black people of their indigenous lands, of their identities, cultural identity, of economic disenfranchisement, and so on. And so that was going too far. What the government of South Africa has proposed over the years, over the decades, in fact, has not gone far enough. And we do see this glacial pace of transformation in South Africa, this glacial pace of redress in South Africa, which is a clear indicator that what the government has done, in as much as it has done quite a lot, has not been enough. And let's look at a very simple thing that I think many South Africans will relate to, Iman, is the issue of unemployment. South Africa has got one of the highest levels of unemployment in Africa and in the world. And one of the things about unemployment in South Africa, that like everything else that is a remnant of our apartheid and colonial past, is that it does in fact have a black face. Let's look simply at what Statistics South Africa has to say. In the second quarter of 2024, right, the unemployment rate for Black people in the country was 36.9%. The unemployment rate for colored people was 22%. The unemployment rate for Indian or people of Asian descent was 12%. And the unemployment rate for white people was just 7.9%. And so you see, even in the discrepancies, even in terms of the levels of unemployment in this country and who unemployment is affecting, even as we recognize it's a national problem. Even that national problem, if you were to go deeper into the statistics and the numbers, you do realize that Black people are disproportionately affected by it. And in fact, Statistics South Africa also says that, the unemployment rate for Black people has not only been higher than the national average over the past decade, but that it has in fact increased by more than 9 percentage points since 2014. And so these remnants of colonialism, this unemployment that arises as a result of structural inequalities and so on, continues to affect Black people even more. And so necessarily the government must intervene, because if we don't, what we run the risk of doing is creating a society in which people who have been on the receiving end of apartheid and colonialism continue in that way for the rest of their lives. It is not sustainable.
And I think what you exhort in your piece is addressing, the refrain of let us replace sentiment with evidence, which you say is borne out by the statistics that continue to affirm the inequality that still persists 30 years into South Africa's democracy, which affects the Black majority in our country more starkly than any other race group. Let's connect what we've just been talking about to the anti-foreigner, white disadvantage and exclusion positioning globally, particularly in Europe and the US, where there's, as you write, a growing anti-immigrant sentiment that you postulate is premised on the, quote, illogical idea that the white race is being displaced by a growing number of people of the global majority.
Yes, so Iman, the term global majority, and I'm glad you spoke of that term. The term global majority, is a term. It's actually a collective term, right? That is used to describe people who are not considered white, right? So it encompasses practically the majority of the population in the world, because it's speaking of Black people, Latinos, Asian, indigenous people, persons of mixed heritage, and so on. These are what we call the global majority, and we call them people of the global majority because that is, in fact, the majority of the people in the world. White people in the world do not constitute, or what we call Caucasians, do not constitute the majority. Now, in Europe and in the United States, there has been a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment. So, Iman, as you would know personally, I recently relocated to Germany, right, where I'm pursuing my PhD in the state of Bavaria. And Germany is actually having its elections that are upcoming in the next few days. And one of the things that, everybody who's been following elections and everything in Europe will have noticed is that a lot of countries in Europe are actually electing very, right-wing and right-leaning governments in their countries and even in the European Parliament. And at the heart of this is fundamentally the migration question, right? There's a very strong sentiment in Europe that, migrants are coming into Europe and they're taking over and so on. It was, in fact, one of the issues at the heart of Brexit. Too many immigrants coming, they're taking over. And there's now this very illogical fear that this growing immigration is going to lead to a situation in which, indigenous European people are displaced, both in terms of numbers, but in terms of culture, right, and beliefs in our society. And this growing sentiment is actually supported by quite a number of people. Right-wing organizations across Europe are gaining a lot of support. It's a very worrying trend. And there's actually been even, you find the growth of podcasts and, social media and so on has also been a very big fuel or a conveyor belt for these kinds of ideas to find expression. A lot of the problems that are arising in Germany now today and in Europe broadly have been largely about this, migrants must go, the foreigners must leave, and so on. They are becoming a problem in our country.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing in the United States and everywhere else, this very strong anti-immigrant sentiment. Africa and South Africa certainly is not unique from that kind of sentiment. The motivations may be slightly different, but there is that growing sentiment, and it is a cause of concern because it's rooted in this idea that the other is a problem, and they are the problem that are bringing the problem in our country, and they're going to take over.
So much else that I wanted to pick up in your piece, and so I'm just going to encourage people to go and read up on it, because you talk about, raising and dealing with the question of whether, DEI initiatives, this is diversity, inclusion and equity policies, are anti-white. The black people can't be racist concept as well, which I think you explained quite well in your piece. I would encourage people who are in this debate to go and have a look at that. But I want to end with how you end your piece. The statement, there is no reverse racism or reverse apartheid in South Africa. Anyone who says anything different, whether it is Donald Trump or the right-wing element inside South Africa, is afflicted with apartheid nostalgia. Such people are extremely dangerous and pose a real threat to the democratic project. Malaika, what then is the antidote to creating a society where everyone feels unsafe and alienated?
At the heart of the matter, really, Iman, the reality of the situation is that transformation is a very painful thing, right? And transformation is especially painful for people who are used to being on the receiving end of benefits, right? And I think white people in South Africa and white people across the world must come to the table. This resistance to change, this resistance to transformation is unhelpful for everyone involved. Because what happens is that, and we see it in South Africa, is such a perfect example for this. What happens in a society when such high levels of inequality exist, where racialized inequalities exist, is that you are going to find high levels of crime, high levels of social unrest and social instability and so on. And this affects both black and white people. White people often speak about in South Africa, the ones who were protesting at the American embassy very recently, were talking about how unsafe they feel in South Africa, how unsafe this country is. Inherently, that country will be unsafe because when such high levels of inequality exist, you've got people who are going to be committing a lot of crimes, a lot of which are going to be economic crimes. And so people need to come to the negotiating table. We need to, maintain this culture of dialogue. And I insist it must be a culture of dialogue and a negotiation and an engagement, right? Because if we don't do that, Iman, the risk that we run is that the other alternative becomes an alternative of violence. And it's something we can ill afford as a country and as a people.
Malaika Mahlatsi, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. More conversations on this certainly are needed.